Hello everyone and welcome to L3RN TV Channel. My name is Philip and I'll be your host for this broadcast. This episode is dedicated to human factors in project planning and risk management, and we will discuss about it with Laurie Bowman, who is an expert in program and project management as well as project control. His professional focus is on helping clients achieve successful and sustainable project and program management outcomes through training and coaching. Now, Laurie, welcome. It's a pleasure to have you on the show.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Philip.
Most projects involve people and they bring change. These two factors are fundamental to the success of any project, yet they're giving only insufficient reference in the models of project management. On the other hand, the psychology of managing the human factor in projects and change is increasingly becoming a significant success factor in project management. Why do we need change initiatives, projects, more now than before?
That is a great question. Thank you, Philip. At the end of the day, the amount of change that we're experiencing is increasing at a rapid rate, and that includes change for a variety of reasons. So we have social change, for example, with increasing urbanisation of our cities, increased digitisation in the way that we do things and the way we communicate with each other. We're seeing huge changes also economically as we start to digitise and figure out new ways of working together, with increases in freelancing type arrangements and working remotely and some of these sorts of things. And of course, environmentally, we're experiencing significant changes as well with carbon emissions and global warming and some of these challenges that are going to change the way we do things. They're telling us that the way we've done things in the past isn't really the way we're going to do things in the future. That means change is going to happen, and that means more projects because, of course, projects are the way that we implement change. So without a shadow of a doubt, becoming more proficient at change is going to be the way that we move in the future.
Why have projects failed in the past, and what can be done about it?
That's a good question. So obviously there's a variety of factors that contribute to why projects haven't been as successful as we'd like them to be, but there's three really core reasons that tend to stand out, particularly for larger, more complex projects, which is where we tend to have projects that fail more significantly. And those three sort of core areas can best be described as, firstly, bias, in particular, the planning fallacy, which is where we tend to be overly optimistic when we consider projects. So this is a very common part of the human condition. We've evolved throughout history to be very good at making all sorts of decisions, but not so much making decisions about very large, complex projects. So we tend to be, or what we tend to do is, we tend to be overly optimistic about the costs. So we tend to understate the costs of a project, and we tend to overestimate the benefits of a project. And this is referred to as the planning fallacy. And so there's a way, in terms of getting around that, well, I'll leave that till a little bit later. I guess the second significant cause of problems on projects is what's referred to as strategic misrepresentation, which is actually lying or distortion. So sometimes when we have the processes for making decisions on projects, we reward projects that appear attractive, and sometimes that can create an incentive for people who are involved in a project to make a project look good, to manipulate the numbers, in other words. So that's another very common form of problem on projects, which causes them to fail down the track. In other words, they don't measure up against the numbers that might have been manipulated a little bit at the start. And then lastly, the other major cause of error or failure on projects is what's been referred to as noise. And noise is more so random error, so large variations in the way that different people assess a project. So as opposed to bias, which is more error that's all tending in one direction, noise is more like a scattergun. So if you imagine somebody shooting, an archer shooting at a target, bias would be if their cluster of shots were all clustered together but some way away from the target or the bullseye, whereas noise is where they're still spread out around the bullseye but they're just scattered over a wide area. So this noise, as it's referred to, tends to be caused by a wide variety of factors such as human competency and skill, as well as simple things such as what mood we might be in. So on at certain, depending on what mood we're in, we're more likely to make decisions one way or the other. So they're the three core areas: bias, strategic misrepresentation, and noise. Now the way we overcome those is, so there's been a lot of research done in this area, but the core way to overcome bias in particular is to create a regular environment, a structured environment, so a well-organised project environment, for example. The second thing to do is to make sure there's many opportunities for the team to learn. So in other words, the team has to be consistently reflecting on what they've done and then seeking to learn. And then the last ingredient is feedback. So we need a feedback loop. And interestingly, all three of these processes are provided by good cost engineering on projects. So it's a really useful technique to reduce bias on projects. The second problem that I spoke about, strategic misrepresentation, is a bit of a trickier one to deal with in practice. But some of the things that we can do is to, firstly, to have independent reviews involved as part of our decision-making processes. So there's somebody independent who might be free from the political influences to come in and review projects prior to decisions being made. And the second one, of course, is once again back to competency. So making sure that those who are responsible for pulling together the business case or the proposal are properly qualified. And in particular, making sure that there's a cost engineer involved who's able to look at the numbers for the project and consider them from an external view as well as an internal view, because we all tend to be a little bit biased when we're considering a project from the inside view. Now, the third of the three common problems that I mentioned was general noise. In other words, large variations in the way that different projects are estimated. So there's a number of different techniques that can be used to try and reduce noise on projects. One of the primary ones is making sure that you've got competent personnel. So in particular, people who have a good command of things like probability and statistics when we're dealing with larger projects, because they tend to be highly uncertain, and we really need people who can consider the project from a probabilistic perspective. And we also need to have a diverse range of stakeholders involved so that a number of problems and a number of risks are envisaged by looking at the project through different lenses. And then lastly, we really need to consider base rates. So look at projects of a similar nature that have been done before, look at it from the external view of the project, and baseline the projects based on base rates for similar projects wherever possible. So they're the sort of three main areas that we can start to look at addressing some of those changes. And a lot of that really does revolve around having good, competent, qualified cost engineers involved in your estimates and proposals as much as possible.
How can we make sure a project manager has the right skill set?
That is a great question. So it's a very challenging role, a project manager. So they really are at the pointy end of projects. Particularly for larger projects, I think it's important for project managers to be well supported. So to have a good team around them and to recognise they don't have to do everything themselves. So by having a good, diverse team around them of broad-ranging skill sets, I think that's the best way to set up a project manager for success. In particular, so project managers are typically very good in dealing with stakeholders and negotiating. They're dealing with a very complex array of information. I think as much as possible, having a good project controls team or cost engineering team is really fundamentally important. So there's a lot of risks that a project manager is dealing with, and the way that a project manager controls those risks, or a strong method for controlling that risk, is by having a good project controls team in place. So setting a strong baseline, setting up the feedback loops so that there's continuous feedback, so the team's continuously learning and adjusting their plans as they develop. And I guess the other one would be a good change management process, once again, a core component of project controls and cost engineering, so that changes are considered, so that the project is flexible enough to consider changes, good changes as they come about, but isn't so relaxed that changes are just happening on an ad hoc manner. So yeah, having that structured team around to support is a really key component.
Thank you, Laurie. And how can we encourage innovation?
Yes, that's a good question as well. And it's a really important one, because with the amount of change that's happening, we really do need to do things in a different way, differently to how we have done in the past. As human beings, one of our many biases is the status quo biases. And this is where we generally have a preference to stick to our baseline, stick to the way that we've always done things. As mentioned, however, we need to change the way we're doing things, including the way we implement projects themselves. And one of the key ways to encourage innovation is to make it safe for project teams to innovate. In other words, make it safe for them to fail. When we try something new, any form of innovation, it's very common that we won't be successful. So within a project, to create that environment where it's safe to do that is a really, really important thing. So that starts with the project manager, but it also includes the project team itself. So the idea should be that as long as teams are thinking through and taking a risk-based approach to their decision making, and as long as they're justifying decisions, that's all that matters. So failure is okay as long as there's ongoing learning happening is a really key way to do it. Another important aspect to consider is really looking at the numbers for our projects. Often innovative projects are very risky, but often offer a higher return on investment than the way that we've done projects traditionally. So also, really looking at the numbers and being open to taking on a project, particularly if we're doing lots of projects so we can diversify the risk of taking on some of those riskier projects that might involve innovation or new technology and new ways of doing things.
Why should companies care about their capacity to innovate?
Well, that's a really good question as well. I mean, it really is the spice of life. I think it was Charles Darwin said, it's not the strongest or the most intelligent of the species survive, it's the one that's most adaptable to change. And in other words, if we can innovate, the more innovative we are, the more we can adapt and change, the more we can develop new products or new processes and bring them to market quickly. So on a whole number of levels, it really is fundamentally important. In the first section, I spoke about some of the changes that we're dealing with in our operating environment, where as well as economic imperatives, there's social changes that we need to consider, environmental changes. So in order to realise new ways of doing things, we have to be innovative. So any enterprise that wants to survive in the new normal, that's going to be the future, really does need to be able to innovate as a core component of that.
How can we develop a performance culture?
I think a good way to develop a performance culture is to look at other industries and that do have a performance culture and try to mimic what they do. So when you look at something like sports, and in particular team sports, there really is a very strong performance culture. There's often a lot of statistics and detailed information, dashboards and performance measures as to how different baseball teams, cricket teams, football teams perform in different environments. So I think there's a lot for us to learn on projects and in project management from the performance culture that we see in sporting teams, for example.
Can you share in detail what these steps might be?
Yes, sure. On a project, for example, there's often a lot of data, a lot of information flying around. And what's important for project teams is to measure what matters. Keep it really simple. Make sure that a project team identifies its values or what's really important and just focus on that. Measure the things that matter. And this can vary from one project or one team culture to another. It might be safety data, it might be cost performance information, it might be resource productivity, whatever it is. Measure what matters is one of the key foundations of developing a performance culture. Another one is mixing up the team. So understanding that decisions drive projects, and by having a diverse team, you're going to encourage better decision making. So have people from a different background, have younger people who might be more tech savvy and more experienced people who might be able to foresee some of the likely problems from decisions. Have people from design phase, from construction, from procurement, from operations and maintenance, clients and customers all involved as part of the decision-making process is another very useful tip to get a performance culture. And then lastly, educating and influencing. So understanding that we're all human beings on projects and all of us tend to resist change in different ways, and we all have a different perspective of the world. So working closely with people, engaging and seeking to educate and influence and bringing people along on a journey, another way to develop a performance culture on a project.
How can we achieve sustainable development?
Yes, well, that's going to be the challenge for all of us. So I don't pretend to know the exact answer for this, but certainly there's some principles that we can certainly consider. So every organisation has different values, and for those organisations that highly value sustainable development, and most companies around the world are doing that, I think to embed that as part of the culture on a project, to have that then become part of the strategy, and for that to then become part of the risk management framework, for example, is a really good start. And the whole idea is once that starts at the top, then governance and risk management processes should reflect those values, so that when decisions are being made, people are not just thinking about the financial viability and the financial sustainability, which is what we've been quite good at traditionally, but we'll also be better considering and weighing up social impacts, environmental impacts, and getting better and better at that. So just as we've had a performance culture towards financial imperatives in the past, more and more there's going to be a greater balance with social and environmental imperatives as well.
We would like to finalize the discussion by understanding what have you learned from COVID?
COVID has been a real wake-up call. So particularly for projects, firstly, they've been heavily impacted, but most importantly, I think we learnt that we can change and we can do things differently very quickly when there's a short-term imperative or there's a short-term impact on our safety and on our way of living. So I think certainly the way that we could adapt very, very quickly to something new that was not foreseen is a huge learning. So a lot of the changes that were required, for example, to deal with things like climate change, often there's just been a very, very slowly approach, and it's tended to be put in the too hard basket. I think now globally we've learned that we actually can respond quite quickly and we can collaborate, in the interest of the greater good. And I think that's going to hold us in good stead, particularly with the amount of change. Like COVID was almost like practice for dealing with larger problems like climate change and these sorts of things. So I think it's really taught us that we can change and adapt. It's taught us that we can collaborate online very proficiently. We can work virtually. So suddenly I think we can collaborate globally even better than we did before, thanks to some of our learnings from COVID.
Thank you, Laurie, for the insights. It was a real pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you very much, Philip. I enjoyed speaking with you.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being part of today's episode. We hope we presented valuable information that you can apply in your own project management. While you can check out our recording of today's episode on our Vimeo and YouTube channels, feel free to watch more shows and even message us with ideas on new topics and guests. Until next time, stay tuned.